Look, I love Warframe as much as anyone else, even though sometimes I come across as one-minded in some ways and petty in some others. However, I firmly believe that DE needs to double down on the type of updates they deliver in the upcoming years if they wish to please their player base as well as ensure the game doesn't keep getting locked in yearly cycles of content droughts. By far the worst content drought we have had was during the several-month-long wait for The Roar Within, and although DE has done a much better job at not repeating past mistakes when developing new content, such as overhyping the update in question, there are still ways they could improve. For starters, DE can take notes from Ubisoft in terms of how future content is announced. For those not familiar, at the beginning of each year, Ubisoft creates a roadmap for each of their still active games such as For Honor or Rainbow Six Siege. This roadmap is of value to their communities because it has two purposes. First off, it serves as a time frame for the players, allowing them to see about how long the content updates will be spread apart, and about how long players will be kept waiting. It also serves as affirmation for the player base that content is being developed, unlike in Warframe where the best we have to go with is soon trademark. Secondly, the roadmap serves as a teaser for the players, by allowing them to see exactly what the developers have planned for their community, such as what new things will be delivered, what improvements will be brought about, and what issues they wish to resolve. In DE's case, I don't imagine that doing a roadmap would be a problem, except for any lore-related content, which could spoil the player base. Development roadmaps are just important overall because they serve as an official to-do list by the developers for their players, meaning that while players will still be waiting for content, they won't at least be sitting around, twiddling thumbs and hoping the next patch isn't just a few bug fixes and a new gun. Secondly, DE can take notes from the developers of Guild Wars 2 in terms of how to advance their lore even while still developing other bigger pieces of content. For those not familiar, Guild Wars 2 has something called the Living World. To put it simply, in order to advance the game's story and reduce player boredom even while tackling other update projects, the developers of Guild Wars 2 add in a small content patch every 2 weeks, which contains quests and sometimes new items which continue and/or build up the game's plotline for the next big expansion or major quest. In other words, they add in new quests to complete every 2 weeks that have players progressing in the game, furthering the plot, and keeping players temporarily occupied. Of course, comparing DE to the developers of Guild Wars 2 is rather silly, because DE's team isn't built for MMO-esque content, hence why they have less manpower. That isn't to say that DE can't hire more talent in the future, or contract outsider help such as how DE has hired a third-party company to take care of our current chat moderation issues. Lastly, DE can take notes from the now-dead game that was Firefall in terms of how to handle game direction. I say this because DE themselves said during DevStream 121 that 2019 will be their most ambitious year yet, and while I am interested in what they have to deliver, I do remain a little bit concerned. I use Firefall as an example for ambition because the original vision of their developers was to create a unique MMO shooter that has never before been seen, but as we all know, it died. It died for a variety of reasons, but there's a simple way to summarize why it died. Pretend for a second that you're a contractor, building a house. During construction, the property gets sold and the new owners say they want an apartment complex instead of a house, so now you begin the process of renovation. However, then an investment group comes along and buys the property, and they want to sell the building and its land for scrap instead, so now you begin the process of demolition. However, before that's even finished, another person comes along and buys the property, but they instead want to turn it into a commercial retail property, so now you have to start remaking what you just removed. At this point, business executives visit the property and demand to know why there are no residents yet and why everything is over budget. I know, that's a really silly and long-winded example, but that's the best way I can explain it. My primary concern for DE here is for them to not be blinded by ambition, because that's how terrible decisions are made, and I'm pretty sure we're fairly familiar with a few instances of DE making terrible decisions. In short, I have 3 points of importance for DE in regards to the new year. Firstly, be clear and concise in what new content will be made, so players have some idea what's coming. Secondly, try to keep your players occupied in intervals so player count doesn't hit the floor after every major content patch. Thirdly, and most importantly, Don't do anything so ambitious in terms of changing the game that you end up just making things worse and anger your community. Thank you for watching.